welcome to another fantastic week of the IDE seminar. We are very pleased today to have Professor Nicholas Ashford with us. He is a professor of technology and policy and director of the technology and law program at MIT. Nicholas and I communicated earlier this year about how we can deal with the free speech and misinformation problem that has arisen. And he wrote a fascinating op-ed in the New York Times about the fairness doctrine, and has been doing extended work on that since he wrote the op-ed. And so he's going to talk to us about his current thinking about the fairness doctrine, but also a much broader range of issues related to misinformation and how we can address it while also protecting what we all know is so important, free speech in our marketplace of ideas. So, Nicholas, it's great to have you. Thank you for spending time with us today, and I will let you take it away.
Okay, thank you very much. And we'll have a Q&A at the end of the talk. We'll invite, so save your questions up, send them into the chat. Well, I've entitled it Actions We Could Take to Address Misinformation and at the same time safeguard the freedom of speech. And I think everybody understands the tension that's involved now. The examples of misinformation are some that you know and some that you might not know. First, of course, there's this nonsense about the stolen election that Trump has pursued. The causes and futures of global climate change, which also still has its detractors. The existence of COVID-19 as a health scourge, the effectiveness or harm from vaccination, and the effectiveness of masking. I mean, those things, those are enough things to be worrying about, that there's a lot of information. And I think the lies that are being permeated are really, I think, challenging the very tenets of democracy. But there's more. There's the question of whether a larger safety net, as envisioned by Biden, will produce inflationary effects with people as varied as Summers and Manchin being on the other side of the question. There's the failure in Afghanistan and whether it really was a failure and whether it was expected. The question of whether we should continue to invest in multilateral joint efforts with other countries or try to go at any of these things alone. The causes and alleviation of poverty, which is still being debated. The challenges of migration. And oddly enough, I mean, migration is a big problem, and the whole question of misinformation or incomplete information is given to us there. Let me spend a moment talking about that. You know, if you look at the published literature, you see that Turkey has succeeded in taking in more migrants from Syria than anywhere else, and they've been lauded quite properly, I think, for doing a terrific job with those migrants. At the same time, you find the Greeks are putting the migrants that do manage across the sea in camps which are pretty despicable. And so if you look at part of the news which says Turkey is doing a great job and Greece is doing a terrible job because they don't have camps that can house people in an acceptable way, but that's only really part of the news. Because I think you have to also acknowledge that the European Union has given 6.5 billion euros to Turkey to basically take care of the Syrian refugees. And every time a Greek sends Turkish or Iranian citizens back to Turkey, they get money from the European Union. On the other hand, the money that was promised to Greeks to alleviate the suffering in the camps has never been allocated. So when you get the whole picture, on the one hand, you say, well, Turkey is doing a terrific job, Greece is doing a terrible job, but then you begin to understand a little bit more how easy or difficult the jobs each country is doing. is reflected by the amount of money that's coming in from the outside. So I just wanted to mention that because I think it's not just lies that are being permeated, it's half-truths or a lack of the whole picture, which is, I think, increasingly a part of all the problems of misinformation. And then finally, I think we would be remiss if we didn't talk about the tremendous number of advertising that's going on of ineffective products or services. The Food and Drug Administration or the Federal Trade Commission doesn't have enough funds or staffing to keep dishonest advertising off of the airways. If you believe that you can grow hair by putting a liquid on top of your head, then all the more power to you. But as far as I know, none of these treatments for hair growing is going to work. Sinan, maybe you want to comment on that if you have different experience. But really, ineffective products or services have not been reined in, and they ought to be reined in, because I think a lot of people depend or pressure the medical establishment to give them therapies which aren't good. So these are all examples of mis or disinformation. I will make the distinction that really we have to deal with in the context of media. Now, what are the media that we're talking about? And most of the attention and much of the attention of Sinan's early efforts were on the platform industry and Google and Twitter and Facebook and the like, the so-called social media, where most people get their information. And so it's right that we pay a lot of attention to that. But there's more than that. There's cable news. And let me say that if you get your news from the platform industry, and then you periodically refer to cable to see if you're hearing the same thing, depending upon whether you watch MSNBC or Fox News, you'll get your preferences reinforced. And so there's a kind of an echo chamber, but the cable news itself is not subject to any kind of restrictions at this point once the fairness doctrine disappeared. There is television and talk radio where the original fairness doctrine existed, but was removed in 1987. So they can pretty well say anything they want, write anything they want. And as I said, there is this multiple echo chamber, which has gotten amplified by the platform industry. There's the print media, which is becoming less important, apparently, from where people get the news. But again, it's a reinforcing media. And different news sources reinforce one each other. That's the thing that really has to be understood. You can't regulate or persuade any one of the media giants to do something more socially responsible if you don't persuade them all, because people are going after market share, and that's driving an awful lot of what's going on here. Now, how does these messages come to people? Well, it comes from government messaging. It comes from political messaging from the politicians and the candidates. There's industrial propaganda, both of the advertising and non-advertising nature. And then there's the advertising situation itself. Let me say that having gone through a Ph.D. program in chemistry and served on the space program, having gone through both a law and economics concentration at the University of Chicago Law School, whose ethics I do not subscribe to. I've gone through a lot of schooling, but the most significant courses I ever took in my life were in high school. One course was on civics. How does the government operate? How does it work? And most people don't even know how that works. They think there are three branches of government, which is the executive, the legislative, and the courts. But actually, there's a fourth branch of government lurking that really affects more of what we do every day than the other three, and that's the regulatory agencies, from the Security and Exchange Commission to the Federal Trade Commission to the Immigration and Natural Services. The regulatory regimes affect more law that affect more people than the other three branches. So actually, in a civics course, you need to learn that it's not just the three registered, as it were, branches of government, but the other regulatory agencies as well. But the second course that had a profound effect on me, and it was taught by a Washington University professor in a suburb of St. Louis in the high school, was a course on propaganda, how to recognize government propaganda, how to recognize industrial propaganda. And that has stuck with me because I think a lot of this misuse or misinformation or disinformation is basically propaganda. Could come from the government, could come from the private sector, could come from the advertising industry, or it could come from the private sector. So I think that the Washington University professor who voluntarily taught these courses in my high school had it right. If you don't get it early, you're not going to be sensitive to critical thinking. And that's a long-term solution that obviously we all want people to think critically and to think deeply, but it isn't something that is happening these days. So let me go to the next slide and talk. I'm going to invoke now a little bit of neuroscience or psychology. How do we know what we know? I mean, we're told certain things, but how do we really know it? And first of all, we tend to go towards news sources or information that confirms our prior bias. It's called anchoring or confirmation bias. And of course, if you only look at certain kinds of social media and you only listen to Fox News and you only listen to talk radio, you're going to get a reinforcement of your prior bias. But so you gravitate in any event towards information that reinforces your prior impressions, values, and opinion. And this is a major problem. But the solution to this problem that's been offered, and I think it's not effective, is actually, well, before we do that, I'll talk about identity group. You want to identify as a libertarian or you want to identify as a radical leftist. You tend to trust those sources more than you do ones that don't sync with your own identity. And then there is the so-called exposure towards balanced coverage. If you ask that the media give equal time or equal number of inches to all sides of a question, you would think that by listening to all sides of a question like antitrust coverage or other things would move you towards the center. But neuroscience tells us something very interesting. If you read a totally balanced coverage, it gives all sides of a question, what really imprints in your brain is your prior commitment. It's as if it was not even there. So just making people read, I mean, you can send people, say, look, you've been looking at one side, let me send you a number of articles over a period of weeks about the other side. And the response that you'll get is, I read everything you sent me, I'm now more convinced than ever that my prior is correct. This turns out to be a problem with the primitive brain. If you don't activate something more than the primitive brain, you're not going to engage people into life-changing habits or views. I always wondered in my almost 50 years of teaching at MIT, why I could easily change my students' minds, but not my fellow faculty. And I think one of the reasons is because you can really challenge your students. In my law courses, I use the Socratic method, which is let them find truth through asking questions. But anyway, it turns out that you can really drill down and grill, ask people why they believe that giving the private sector more money will create more jobs when the evidence goes the other way. So you can actually, by engaging people at a higher neuronal level, you can actually change their mind, but just throwing balanced coverage at them will not do it, will not do it. They'll wash dishes while the coverage is being talked about that they don't agree with. And then what really counts, and it's very present in the law-related courses, but it's also present in what we call debate. Debate, what passes for debate in this country is one person's view and then followed by another person's view with very little cross-examination. And unless you really interrogate somebody who's representing a particular perspective, you will not activate the higher brain functions necessary for critical thinking. And I'm reminded of a program that some of you may know if you've ever spent any time in the UK. It's called Hard Talk, where the interrogator for a whole hour takes somebody like the head of the PLO or somebody who's promoting anti-vaxxing or whatever it is, and submits them to a whole hour of critical interrogation, which does not allow them to bypass the question by a soundbite. And so if you watch we also see this cross-examination in legal proceedings or political discourses. I think I see that that CNN does a lot of this. So does the public television. But really, the political discourse, which really cross-examines people, is what you need to bring statements out and clear. And there you will find people changing your mind. Of course, if you invite a faculty member to lunch, you can't cross-examine them. He'll never have lunch with you again. But you can do anything you want with students. Ask them how they know this, what did they read, what haven't they read, and pretty soon you begin to engage a higher place of discovery. Now, there is a general and a long-term problem and a failure to practice critical thinking, which is to increase the demand for complete information, not just partial truths, and to distinguish between facts and opinion. I'm reminded of a woman on television who was interviewed, who asked how she knew something was true about the vaccines. And she said, well, I saw it on television. And that was the response. And as far as they're concerned, they muddy the distinction between meritorious opinions and things which are just how you feel about something. All you feel about something isn't very impressive. So those are the problems that we face. Now, the solutions that are offered, and I'll talk about them, and which ones I think I favor, and ones I have. One solution is you really ought to rein in the freedom of speech. I mean, they say you cannot shout fire in a crowded theater, but everything else seems to be allowed. In the recent suit decided in May of last year, Washington League for Increased Transparency was decided against plaintiffs. They sued Fox News because they lied and because they violated the Consumer Protection Act by basically fermenting anti-vaccine information, which turns out statistically to have hurt a lot of people. The more people believe in the lies that Tucker Carlson and company Hannity pervades on Fox News, the less masking they do, the less social distancing they do. So there's real harm. I myself think this case was decided incorrectly. I know freedom of speech is sacrosanct. The only thing you can't do is shout fire in a crowded theater. I think we've overstepped our bounds on preventing government from reining in mischievous speech. But that's my opinion. That's not the opinion of the courts. Even though Washlight, as the plaintiff, allegedly, just outright lies, they seem to be okay and they're protected by freedom of speech. Outright lies are different than defending communism or defending a particular piece of data or study. But they also said that the Consumer Product Safety Commission was meant to be targeted towards people involved in trade and commerce. Well, I would argue that outright lies on the vaccine is affecting trade and commerce. It certainly is affecting the extent to which people will take the vaccination. So I, for one, think that this case was wrongly decided. But there you have it. Freedom of speech reigns supreme, and it will stay. So then the question is whether self-monitoring of any kind, like Facebook has attempted, will do any good. And we see that it doesn't really move the trick any more than oversight boards. And I want to remind you that that Facebook in Canada took down the ad for a new film called The New Corporation. There was a film called The Corporation, which talked about all the harm that corporate structures visit upon democratic societies. But this is in the Canadian context. They have a new film called The New Facebook. And without satisfactory explanation, they just took the ad down. Facebook took the ad down, which I think is a real violation of, frankly, freedom of speech and everything else. But I think you cannot leave it to the companies to self-regulate. We might have some discussion on this. Then there's an action which the Biden administration has embraced, which is to revise antitrust law and enforcement. In other words, in the US, break up Facebook. Well, if you have a dozen Facebooks running around, I think it's going to be even harder trying to rein in misinformation. So even though the new head of the Federal Trade Commission is antitrust division is at least Lena Khan wants to try to do this. I think it's wrong-headed. And the Digital Markets Act in Europe, which is going even further, tries to rein in the anti-competitive activities practiced for sure by the platform companies, but I'm not sure antitrust law as practiced is likely to take care of this. And let me talk a little about this. And that is that I went to the University of Chicago for my study of law and economics, and traditional antitrust regulation is viewed by both the US and the EU courts are heavily influenced by that University of Chicago. And their perspective is that the traditional concern with economic and innovation effects or on economic exploitation of excessive power. But as Lena Khan points out, it's not the market distortions that are crucial. And this is very important, that concentrated economic power gives rise to concentrated political power. And 0.1% of the population controls basically the agenda and the legislation, which has an overwhelming effect on agenda setting, policy implementation, and legislation. And it's not at all clear, even if Lena Khan recognizes it, it's not at all clear that the courts, either in the European Union or the American context, will reflect those concerns. They're looking for effects on market. That was the University of Chicago George Stiegler approach, and it dominates. So I'm not very enthusiastic about antitrust law being a vehicle to rein in the social speech. So we've had those, and we've discussed these four things. Let me now discuss removal of liability in what's called Section 230 of the Communication Decency Act. Right now, those platform companies are really immunized from anybody suing them for saying something harmful or liable. And there's a motion in the Congress, and Senator Warner is leading this effort to basically remove the immunity. I don't think that's going to have any effect either. And I think in my article in the New York Times, I talked about expanding the fairness doctrine to the other media. And I think that would have an effect. But I was then persuaded that really you can't just present both sides, as I've indicated. You've got to require more interrogation and cross-examine and eliminate what passes for debate. Now, the longer term solution is, of course, get people to recognize propaganda when they see it and misinformation when they see it, and to have them access a wide variety of news sources. But I am persuaded by Professor Michael Vandenberg from Vanderbilt University, who published a wonderful article on the creation of a private and expanded fairness doctrine that not only refers to all of the media, but that creates a private organization of respected individuals who will mark and grade the different sources of media, whether they're A or B or C or D, on the truth and inclusiveness, and let the market work. If people see that the social media have been graded a D rather than an A, they may go to another social media which is more fair. So I believe that that article really deserves to be read and deserves to be promoted, especially since the fairness is the government control of fair reporting doesn't seem to be alive and well. So let me stop there. I've gone a little under 25 minutes and let you all bring questions or disagreements or perspectives. And Sinan, I'm of course very anxious to get your perspective because you didn't deal with some of these issues. You dealt with the platform company, and you might have thought about some of these since your broadcast.
Can you, Nicholas, thank you very much. This is extremely helpful and thought-provoking. Could you maybe do us all a favor and describe in a little bit more detail the fairness doctrine and how it would be implemented and how it would directly address in a little bit more detail the problems that you've outlined here?
Okay, there are two different problems. One are just outright lies. So, you know, an entity, a private organization, which was staffed with recognizable, fair people, would say, look, these are lies. These are lies. I mean, masking is effective, for example. But then there is a completeness that also has to be talked about, and whether you get a complete picture. And the bringing in of ideas, which are omitted by partial truth, has to be worked. And by the way, people would say, well, who's going to fund this? My idea was to have it funded from the taxes on the media. That there ought to be a non-governmental, because of our posture on government intervention, creation of a grading system, which like the grading system for buying appliances. You can buy a good refrigerator or a bad refrigerator, and the energy rating is given to you by an organization which measures the energy effectiveness. So obviously people who have greatly recognized independence, they could be from journalism schools, they could be journalists. I think that in the media now today, you have good journalism and not bad journalism. By the way, I want to compliment the New York Times. When I wrote that op-ed in the New York Times, and you'll see it if you see the link to that organization, every single assertion that I made had to be backed up by data. I couldn't make any assertion just because I wrote an op-ed piece. And so I think you have to have documentation of what you're asserting to be true or untrue. Is that helpful?
Very helpful. Thank you. I want to throw it to my very long time and close friend, Marshall Van Alstyne, who's got his hand raised. Marshall?
Yeah.
Thanks, Sinan. Actually, love Sinan's work on some of the social media stuff, so I really appreciate this particular talk. So I find, Nicholas, I really appreciate your commentary. I sent you an email earlier on the wash light.
Yes, I get it. Yeah.
So I went and read that, and I have to agree with you. I think it was fascinatingly wrongly decided. So it's a really interesting case where there's clear social harm, indeed even deaths, as a consequence of misinformation on the COVID vaccine.
Indeed. Yeah.
So the question then becomes, however, let's put it in two different ways. One, it was probably rightly decided based on current legal theory. But then the question would be, can you articulate a legal theory by which you would overturn that decision? So we can design either two approaches. One would be, well, how can we deal with misinformation given the current law, which has led to some very bad consequences such as this one? Or can we revise the law based on a better legal theory that would allow us to deal with this misinformation? So what would a legal theory be to overturn that case?
The legal theory is it's harm of any kind to the society, which can be demonstrated, is a reason to rein in that harm. It's not just shouting fire in a crowded theater. I mean, let's analyze shouting fire in a crowded theater. First of all, it's only likely to affect about 250 people, right? And it's certain to, I mean, it isn't certain, but it's likely that people will stampede, but maybe not. Maybe if the exit signs are very clearly in a direction to walk slowly and empty the auditorium. But I don't see the sharp distinction between trying to prevent a mob in a theater and trying to prevent people from taking vaccination. I'm scratching my head.
So let me,
legal theory is a theory of harm. It's the theory of tort.
So let me agree with you. So I think it's fundamentally correct that the theory of harm probably is a leverage point. But having read the Washlight case to try to understand it, the deontological view, that is, they basically decide based on if it fits in a particular category, then government cannot touch it. In this case, the decision was that this was on a matter of public concern, and on matters of public concern, the government cannot intervene, period. It's the strict scrutiny case. So no matter what the harm is, government can't intervene. The counterbalancing theory is the reason is that if government were to intervene on matters of public concern, government itself could have the conflict of interest and therefore do even perhaps more damage. How would we overcome that? That's the current legal theory.
Well, I think this thing, public concern, is really a red flag. It's the marketplace of ideas. It's not public concern. It's the marketplace, the public market of ideas. Now, the two reasons that this case turns on, one is that the Consumer Product or Consumer Safety Act dealt with trade and commerce. I think that's easy to overcome. It does deal with trade and commerce. Nothing could be more involved than trade and commerce than the practice of public health. So, but the second thing is that this is as the plaintiff argued, this is an out and right lie, which even takes the theater analogy out of consideration, because we're not talking about shouting fire in a crowded theater when there's a fire. We're talking about shouting fire in a crowded theater when there isn't a fire. And I think we need to expand the Supreme Court. I think that's the only practical outcome. I think that changing the DNA of the present justices, 6 of which come from a very well-known religious commitment, I think it is outrageous that they should be deciding issues of public concern. It is not just any public concern. It's the fact that they're attended by lies. I would have no trouble writing the majority and minority opinion for this case. I think it's a ruse.
I just want to jump in really quickly because, and I'm glad I've got you both in this conversation, because I want to ask a question that I would love to hear answers from both of you, which has been on my mind. And then I want to go to Bill Taylor, who's been chatting it up in the chat with some interesting and important points and questions, which I would like to address next. If Bill, if you wouldn't mind unmuting after this next conversation and sort of walking us through your questions and concerns. Nicholas, I don't know if you know, but Marshall Van Alstyne and Mike Smith wrote a really nice piece recently pertaining to limitations of Section 230, where they lean heavily on the concept of harm. And I had a conversation with Mike about it, and my flippant reaction to their beautifully written piece was, yes, but the devil's in the details. How do you define harm? And how you define harm, that's actually the hardest part of the issue of applying harm as a limiting factor for Section 230. So Marshall, I wanted to ask you that. And then Nicholas, I wanted to ask you, how should we be thinking about harm in this debate?
So I love that question. I think it's absolutely one of the right questions. I actually think Bill asks another one, which is the other question that's important, which is what governance mechanism to do it, and then what's the test? So one of the ways I would try to solve that problem is not to try to decide on a specific instance basis. All too often you have a question of things that are partially true or half true, for which you still get a decision error. I actually think the better way to deal with this, the specific mechanism of which we weaken Section 230, is to use something incredibly powerful that Sonia, I know you're familiar with, is the central limit theorem. What I would do is treat this as a pollution problem, and use statistical sampling. On that basis, what we do, and I can get any confidence level you want to give me, I simply take a larger sample of how much claims are occurring and how much damage is then falling on those claims. So if I want to know about dioxin in the air or the water, or effluent coming out of a factory, I don't sample every molecule, I don't sample every ounce. And if I'm taking your cholesterol, the doctor doesn't take all your blood, they take a sample. So what we do is we take a sample. If you want increased level of certainty on the negative claims, false claims, or the harms that's taking place, you take a sample and you penalize based on the density of damage that's happening in that sample. And basically you're asking how much are they able to clean it up?
So excellent. I love this idea. Two quick feedback and requests for comment from both of you are, this highlights the dramatic importance of transparency, because we've seen news headline after news headline about the inability to actually get a representative sample of either the misinformation or the harm from Facebook or any other platform company with regard to what's actually moving around, at least on social media. Maybe with the news channels, we can get a better sample. And also the problem of demonstrating causal harm, which, as you know, has been something I've been trying to work on for 15 years. And is an incredibly thorny problem. So just a quick comment on those two, Marshall and or Nicholas, or both, and then we'll go to Bill.
Let me weigh in here. First of all, I want to borrow from the Supreme Court about the definition of pornography. What did they say? They said, you know it when you see it.
But
some things are self-evident.
But
okay.
We don't know what people are seeing on Facebook because it's a black box.
No, you do. There is a law review article written about the analysis of the Fox audience, and they actually end up doing less social distancing and less mask wearing. If you take the public health literature, forget about 230. If you just take the public health literature, you know that mask wearing eliminates harm. There's no question about it.
No. What I mean is the prevalence of and the harm from misinformation on social platforms is not visible in an unbiased way to anyone right now.
Yes, it's visible. If you read the article, the analysis and the lawsuit shows that, in fact, people who believe nonsense do more public health harm.
I'm just saying you don't know that that's from what they read on Facebook. They may just be of a certain political orientation, and they may hate the government, and the government says mask, and therefore they don't mask, even whether they're on Facebook or not, or whether they've seen misinformation on Facebook or not. I'm talking about the sampling of misinformation on social platforms. Marshall?
So I have two answers for you. And I think you'll have to agree or not, but I think you might like both of them. One of them is exactly as in the case of air or water effluent. You simply require a broad sample, and this could include even some of the closed and private chat rooms that have been anonymized. So you don't necessarily have to know the identities at all. You simply get a sampling of the messages or the streams themselves, and that would give you the unbiased sample that you're looking for. The second mechanism is actually, believe it or not, we've proposed a new data right called an in situ data right. Here's how it works. Individuals allow any third party of their own choosing to access their own data so they could see what ads and other information they're seeing. You're no doubt familiar with the NYU group, whose access, they got something like 1,600 people to grant permission, and their access was shut down by Facebook
Yeah.
On the basis they weren't, that this was revealing the information they had, revealing private information. If you were granted an in situ data right, you would enable third-party government inspection by anyone who'd volunteered, which would give you then secondary oversight and assurance of what information you're actually being shown. So there are either of these two mechanisms, one by government fiat, or second by this new data right that we're proposing that would prevent Facebook from foreclosing that kind of research opportunity.
Let me add something. I think you can't separate the question of harm from the cure that would be happening. If you had a legal fairness doctrine enhancement, which is what I argued in my op-ed piece, Fox News would not be able to present one side of the question. They would have to provide, not just calling it a hoax, they would have to provide all of the information in an unbiased fashion. If you had a legal fairness doctrine. A private expanded fairness doctrine would at least grade Fox News on the issue of vaccines, and people could say, I mean, you want to be proud of the fact that you're watching a D-rated television station? I think you have to leave that to the market. The long-term answer, and I know I'm going on, but the long-term answer, you've got to teach people how to think critically.
Well, I think I certainly agree with that last sentence. I think this leads very nicely into Bill Taylor, who I can't actually hear bristling in the background, but can metaphorically hear bristling in the background. Bill, I'd love for you to comment and question what has been said based on what you've been writing in the chat. If you wouldn't unmute and just speak to us. Thanks.
All right, I've unmuted. Am I coming through?
Yes, indeed.
There's so many buttons and knobs on these things that you never know what's going to happen when you push.
We don't see you. We don't see you.
Well, okay, I'm pretty ugly. I can try that. Let's see. Is that any good?
Yeah, that's ugly. That's really ugly.
Thank you, Bill.
I'm probably not
ahead,
worth
Bill.
viewing. I didn't want to
Go
waste
ahead.
the bandwidth, but anyway, okay, here's the, remember, the fairness doctrine on talk radio existed a long time ago, and it was enforced by a government bureaucracy, and all bureaucrats believe that they're on the side of the angels and their budget should be increased next year. Therefore, they are convinced that anybody who speaks about smaller government or wants to cut back on the government is unfair. And therefore, they would enforce that view back when they had the legal authority to do so. And then when the fairness doctrine went away, conservative talk radio exploded, and no one has ever been able to get a liberal talk radio program to work. The original fairness doctrine then suppressed what became a fairly lively communications media. Now, there are still people who believe that Rush Limbaugh was the embodiment of evil because he was against a lot of government programs, and they're entitled to that opinion, but suppressing that sort of view is common to what the fairness doctrine did. Consider a really recent case. When the lab leak theory was first proposed, both Facebook and Google and I think a bunch of other groups decided that was fake news. They suppressed it utterly. And now that the fairness doctrine has produced some documentation coming out, it looks more and more like the lab leak theory, at the very least, is credible enough to be worth examining. Suppressing it was not a good idea back when. It was worth discussing. And now we're hearing that people who have won Nobel Prizes and are highly regarded epidemiologists are being suppressed because they're not throwing out supporting the current narrative. So the question, who defines fair and who defines harm, as you talked about before, one of the gentlemen has been researching it for 15 years. Those are very, very difficult questions. Just consider crazy, for example. Everybody agrees that crazy people should not have access to dangerous implements like knives. In New Hampshire for a while, it was pretty easy to get somebody locked up by calling them crazy. It turned out that most of the people being locked up that way were wealthy people whose heirs wanted access to the money. So they made it much more difficult. Now, if you just want a guardianship of someone, a court appoints an attorney whose job is to argue that the person is not impaired. And you have to prove it pretty convincingly. I don't remember what the legal standard is, but it's pretty heavy. It's not beyond a reasonable doubt. It's one of the other ones. And there's it's many fewer people have been locked up that way. again, as you point out, the details are very difficult. And so I would wonder who you were going to talk about, who you're going to give the authority to suppress these things. Look at the stuff that Facebook is being accused of. Apple is saying they're going to take down Facebook's app because Facebook is facilitating the trading in domestic workers who are effectively enslaved. I'm sure if Facebook doesn't want to do that, I think they're just overwhelmed with the volume and they're unable to do that.
Okay, so I think we get the basic question is, how can we envision a government sort of truth body appropriately, effectively, and in an unbiased manner, sort of applying a fairness doctrine without curtailing sort of broadly speech as we know it in an unbiased way, I guess is the question. And then just to let everyone know, I have to go teach. I thought this was an amazing discussion. I'm sure it will continue for the next 13 minutes, but I've got to sign off to go teach. And I'm going to let Carrie and Hong Yi take over of the moderation. So thank you all very much. And I will be listening to the answer to this one to Nicholas. Thank you.
Fairness doctrine doesn't eliminate representation. It puts representation in a context. You have something for or something against. Take the issue of whether masking is effective. You can argue for, you can argue against. The arguments against don't hold up to scientific examination. I think we have to regard on science. It's not a question of promoting one view versus another. It's a question of promoting truth as opposed to unverified assertions.
Let me interrupt you and just ask you a question that I've heard asked. And so forgive me that it comes from me, but I have heard, and we all know that there is a narrative in the zeitgeist today that says that science is corrupt, that science and scientists funded by the government, advocating masks, doing these studies, that show a randomized controlled trial of over 300,000 people in Bangladesh that show that masking reduces the spread of coronavirus is all corrupt. That's not
backed up by any evidence of any kind.
But I think what we've lost here, what we've lost here in a sense is that that narrative questions the very foundation of reliance on quote unquote science and evidence as a gold standard for determining the truth. Okay.
Well, it's in the Constitution. It's in the Constitution.
I'm giving you a sense for what I see in the zeitgeist, not what's right or wrong. I'm a scientist, as everyone knows. I believe in the scientific method. I believe in empirical evidence and following where it leads in terms of making conclusions about society. But there's a narrative that is sort of undermining that entire enterprise as being legitimate. Marshall?
So I actually think there's a solution for that. You've identified one problem is that there's always a chance to discredit the rater, whoever the rater is, and that's infinitely recursive. And so that in its sense is an unsolvable problem. I believe that a way to deal with that is actually to start using peer juries. It's harder for folks to discredit the certification mechanism when it is representative of the very people they themselves represent, when it is representative of the in-group. That leads to a separate problem of jury nullification of the truth. I think the way you handle that is typically to sample somewhat differently among the scientists and peers, and what you're trading is accuracy for legitimacy. So the more it is representative of the folks that are offering the critique, the more you have legitimacy. The more you're sampling from the experts in the peer, the more you're sampling towards accuracy. I think that may help solve that problem.
Let me bring into something which is really, it has to do with the federal rules of evidence. We used to follow in the trial courts what was called the Fry rules of evidence. which was that only dominant theories of causation could be presented. And then we had the Dobert decision, which said no, legitimate perspectives which counter the mainstreamed explanation are fair game to be added to the mix of things that people think about. Look, there was a time when we thought that acid caused ulcers. It took 18 years of experimentation to prove that it's not acid that causes ulcer, it's a bacterium. And the medical establishment moved very slowly to change things. And I would certainly say that there are dominant scientific perspectives which are not the whole truth. And you could label them as corrupt. But as an establishment, we have moved towards more and more requirements that the science on a particular issue be proved correct. And in the course of time, it turns out that the mainstream is either reinforced or it's refuted. I mean, Kuhn wrote a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions that showed that science was rather jagged. It moved from one truth to another over time. But that doesn't mean at any particular time we're doing something which is unfair or harmless. I mean, I think the people who argue science is corrupt, they're getting their money from the government, need to inform themselves of the studies that are not funded by the government, which are independently studied and which do bear the test of time.
Thank you. So I think we do have another question from the audience. So let me just pull that up and see if the person who asked would like to talk directly. So is Taskin Basha, are you available to get on the mic and ask your question, or should I ask it for you?
Hey, hi.
Hi, the floor is yours.
It was very sweet.
Yeah. Thank you for the opportunity. So, hi, Professor Ashford. I'm from India, and I'm a digital creator. I have a YouTube channel which has 2.6 million subscribers, and I've witnessed both as a creator and as a consumer how misinformation affects everything from trade to mental health. It is used to desensitize masses with content clutter. So do you think the industries would be open to adopting modification of engagement algorithms driven by ethical machine learning to fight misinformation? Because I'm trying to read the literature and see what academia has to say to solve the problem of fake news. But it might sound silly, but the question is, does the industry do anything to take up any suggestions that academia has to fight fake news?
Well, it depends upon the industry. If they've got a dog in that fight, they're going to continue to perpetuate the use of a pesticide like chlorpyrifos or a particular pharmaceutical. I mean, industry may not lie, or it may lie, but it's only telling partial truths. And so, by the way, I think here at MIT, David Autor and Darren Acemoglu have done terrific work throwing questions on artificial intelligence and data mining. I mean, I think these are not, even though MIT as an institution has endorsed the wonderful things to be expected from this technology, these two economists have thrown sharp relief on just how corrupted the system could be. I think it becomes us all useful to look at the reservations about the emerging technologies. The jury is not at all in.
Thank you. Are there any more questions on the floor? If so, you can raise your hand or write it into the chat box. And if not, I guess we're coming close to the hour, so we might just end it a few minutes early. So I'm going to wait for like half a minute to see if any raise hands.
let me just say something, and that is.
Oh, wait,
I
sorry.
think
Bill Taylor does want to say
Oh.
something. So Bill, you can go ahead and like unmute yourself and offer your
Okay,
comments.
well, I think it is pretty generally agreed that the lab leak hypothesis, although not proven, was certainly worth discussing. Yet it was suppressed by our social media firms for over a year. How do we prevent future suppressions of what turned out to be credible hypotheses? We're having lots of people, it is claimed, who have pretty good credentials in epidemiology whose views don't support the current narratives, and they're being suppressed. I mean, that's the kind of rumor, whatever it may be, which greatly undermines the overall credibility of the scientific enterprise. The Bangladesh story, I've read articles which rip apart the analysis of their data, showing that the control groups were in fact not comparable to the others, and offering other explanations for the reduction of infection rates in the areas where they claims of masking proved success. I mean, I haven't seen refutations of that. These kind of debates, if they're suppressed, means it heightens the perception of corruption. Because remember, everybody wants to trace funding. It appears that the main purpose of doing government research is to get follow-on funding. And so it's relatively hard to avoid the perception of bias, particularly if competing narratives appear to be being suppressed. And that's where these kinds of trying to control what goes into the discussion that's where that's going to lead.
I think you have to distinguish a situation where the offered explanation is as doubtful or unproven as the hypothesis. I mean, right now, and I think the CDC is looking at it, we don't know whether it's the wet markets or it was a laboratory leakage of the coronavirus that really dominated the picture. The truth of the matter is there are two hypotheses where the evidence is not strong in either case. And under those conditions, I would say a credible hypothesis, even without data, ought to be recognized as a credible hypothesis, not truth. But then there's a situation where there's clear evidence that one thing is correct, and the evidence on the other side is a hypothesis without evidence. And I think hypotheses without evidence in the face of a strong evidentiary case is not the same. It's not the same. But
and how do we avoid suppressing things like lab leak, which turned out to be quite credible once we got there? And
come forward with the data. Come forward with the data.
They did the FOIA request. They got a lot of reports about what was going on in Wuhan, which weren't known at the time. And that exploration that was stopped for a while. And with respect to masking, there's an enormous number of articles which show that it's used in the United States in practical things. Mask mandates have had any desired effects.
I contest that assertion. I contest that assertion. You're dead wrong. You're dead wrong. You can't make that assertion.
Well, I can send you some graphs and some reports that appear to be been based on CDC data.
Well, then you got to look a little.
States. We can.
You got to look a little more carefully. There's no credible evidence that masking is not effective. None. None. Stop asserting what is not true. That contributes to misinformation.
Thank you. And there's actually one last question we can finish, and we'll use that to finish out the discussion from Arcangelo Leone de Castris. He says he was curious to hear a bit more from you, Professor Ashford, about how you think critical thinking could be stimulated across the population at a large scale. So aside from long-term reform of education, what are you thinking more precisely?
Well, I shared with you my high school experience. I think the recognition of propaganda and facts that are not based by evidence need to be taught early in the time of someone's education. And then in terms of people talking nonsense, of which this session had its fair share of nonsense. That when people assert something is true, demand to see the proof, demand to see the evidence. Science is what the best that we have. It's not perfect, and it does change according to the times. But just putting an alternative hypothesis is not good enough. The hypothesis has to have data. It has to have follow-up data. It has to have subsequent analysis. I am well conscious that an association does not prove causation. But when you have an association that is backed up with a medical or scientific theory as to how something happened, it strengthens the inference, I say inference, that association should be regarded as causation, at least for the time being. At least for the time being. We have plenty of examples where association and causation turned out not to be true. Let me give you an example. In Woburn, Massachusetts, the chemical industry accepted the fact that trichloroethylene in the wells in Woburn were responsible for the leukemia in the children. Later analysis showed that it was naturally occurring chemicals that were causing, not those that were added by the chemical industry. But that time did come. That time did come. It was not radiation in the ground, and it was radiation in the ground and not trichloroethylene. So when someone has an alternative explanation that deserves exploration, it should be explored. I agree with that. But not every alternative explanation deserves to be explored. Should you look at the howling at the moon as a cause of COVID? There's a hypothesis. It's when dogs howl at the moon that we have COVID. Now, are you under an obligation to investigate that? There is no theory by which howling at the moon becomes a credible hypothesis. I put the term credible in front of the word hypothesis, not any old hypothesis. And as far as the origin of COVID-19, I think that the lab leak is a credible hypothesis that deserves investigation. And I don't think anybody is saying that it isn't.
Thank you, Professor Ashford. So that concludes today's seminar. And I'd like to give a big hand to Professor Ashford and for all the discussants and people who raised their questions and comments. And also stay tuned for next week. We have, at the same time, another IDE seminar speaker. We're going to have Sonia Jaffa from Microsoft Research to discuss her research with Dave Holtz and other co-authors on COVID's impact on productivity at the workplace. Thank you.